Hello and welcome back to The Language of Power, a podcast brought to you by the European Policy Centre's Europe in the World programme. Every 2 weeks we bring you insight on the latest geopolitical developments, how they affect Europe, and how Europe can affect them. I'm Paul Taylor, Senior Visiting Fellow at the EPC, and I'll be your host on these deep dives into global and European politics and security. Well, the dust is just settling on another NATO summit, which Donald Trump threatened to wreck with his bad-mouthing of allies and egotistical showmanship, but which ended in sweetness and light, with the alliance surviving to fight another day, and Europeans showing they are stepping up to take more responsibility for their own defense. As often, it's hard to draw the line between the US president's sometimes incoherent and insulting streams of consciousness and the official message of unity, resolve, and military burden shifting, which emerged from the Ankara summit. Trump repeated his obsession with taking control of Greenland from NATO ally Denmark, threatened to cut trade ties with Spain over its criticism of his war on Iran, and claimed again that America was doing all the defense spending in NATO and getting no allied help in return. Yet the final declaration, which Trump signed up to a few hours after this rant, pledged unwavering support for Ukraine, ironclad commitment to collective defense under Article 5, and quotes, a stronger Europe in a stronger NATO. Supporting those bold words were announcements of tens of billions of dollars of long-term contracts for the defense industries, including important joint procurement initiatives for equipment needed to plug the gaps which a disengaging United States will leave in European air and missile defenses, air-to-air refueling, and long-range conventional missiles. However, it remains unclear whether this burden shifting to a more European NATO will take place in an orderly, phased way, giving the Europeans time to strengthen their defense before US capabilities are withdrawn, or whether there'll be more sudden, unilateral force reductions by the Pentagon, motivated as much by political spite at individual allied leaders as by any strategic rationale. So is NATO stronger or weaker after the Ankara summit? How confident can European allies be that the US would come to their assistance if a revanchist Russian President Vladimir Putin took a bite out of a Baltic state or ramped up his hybrid warfare against Europe? Are we witnessing a long overdue managed burden shifting in which European allies take prime responsibility for the conventional defense of their continent, backed by key US military enablers and the US nuclear deterrent? Or are we seeing a chaotic disengagement by a president who keeps demonstrating his lack of strategic patience, leaving Europe exposed at the most dangerous moment since the end of the Cold War? Well, to discuss these questions, I'm delighted to have two guests who contributed to the EPC's compendium on the countdown to the NATO summit. Jennifer Kavanagh, who is a Senior Fellow and Director of Military Analysis at Defense Priorities, a Washington, D.C.-based think tank that advocates a realist restraint in U.S. military engagements around the world. And my colleague Iana Maisuradze, a policy analyst at the EPC, who leads our Road to the NATO Summit project. Welcome to both of you. Jennifer, let me start with you. In your contribution to the EPC compendium, you basically argue that it was right for the US to retrench conventionally from Europe and for European nations to take responsibility for their own defense. Given that starting point, what do you make of the outcome of the Ankara summit? Are we on the way to a sort of NATO 3.0 advocated by the Pentagon? And how much further should this US disengagement go?
Well, I'm encouraged by some outcomes of the NATO summit, but disheartened and disappointed with others. My bottom line when it comes to the U.S. role in European security is that European security should be managed entirely by Europe within 5 or so years, and that includes conventional and the nuclear piece. So I'm less focused on what Europe spends on defense, which has been a big focus of the Pentagon. I think European countries should figure out what they need to be secure, and they should do that. And if that means spending 5% of GDP on defense, that's great. And if it's something else, that's great too. Ultimately, I think the U.S. should have very few military forces left in Europe, many fewer than it has today. And if it remains part of NATO, it should be as a supporting member, able to provide combat support in a crisis, but not to be like on front line. And we're a long way from that. And I actually don't think the Trump administration shares that goal, even if they do want more burden shifting. So when it comes to the NATO summit, I wasn't really interested in talking about who met what spending target. What I did find interesting, though, was the formation of the new defense deals that you mentioned, especially those that don't include the United States. There were a lot of defense contract signs with U.S. defense contractors. We knew going in that this would happen. It was sort of an effort to bribe the United States to stay in. But I was much more interested in the contracts between European countries that did not involve the United States, because I really don't believe that Europe can have an independent defense without an independent defense industry. I don't think buying U.S. weapons to bribe the U.S. to stay in NATO or to stay involved in European security will work. It might work with Trump temporarily, but he keeps coming back and asking for new things. And over the long term, I don't think it guarantees a U.S. commitment. So on NATO 3.0, I actually have to say I don't know what that is. I know Bridges' version. He's articulated a fairly coherent version, but it's unclear to me whether NATO 3.0 means Europe takes over conventional security and the U.S. offers the nuclear umbrella, or the U.S. keeps doing everything that it's doing and NATO just does more. I've heard both versions. Or is it something in between? If we're really aiming for this first division of labor between nuclear and conventional, we're not close to that at all, and we didn't make any progress towards that. If we're talking more about Europe doing more and the U.S. doing the same, that's basically where we are. And that's, I think, my biggest disappointment with the summit, is that this is not burden shifting. Europe doing more and the U.S. doing the same is not burden shifting. Maybe it leads to a stronger NATO, but that's not my personal view of what the U.S. should be doing when it comes to European security. And so I think that's why I was really disappointed, because it showed no progress towards actual U.S. disengagement from European security.
For listeners who don't know, the bridge that you talked about is not a bridge too far, but Elbridge Colby, who is the Undersecretary of War, we have to say now, for policy, and who made a speech in Brussels in February where he laid out a vision of NATO 3.0. But Jennifer, it sounds to me like you'd like to go a lot further and essentially withdraw the US nuclear umbrella and tell the Europeans, you're on your own, but we might just come and help you if you really got into a mess. Is that right?
That's my medium-term goal. I don't want that to happen overnight. I don't think it can happen overnight. I'm very much in favor of some kind of managed transition where the U.S. lays out what it will do on what time frame and then sticks to that time frame, giving Europe time to decide how it wants to manage its defense. But the U.S. should retrench, in my view, regardless of what Europe does. It shouldn't be contingent on Europe stepping up, but the U.S. should coordinate a transition with Europe. And, that is based on my view that U.S. security and European security are not the same. And that was the premise and the assumption that underlay sort of the U.S. Article 5 commitment, was that the U.S. could not be secure unless Europe was secure. I disagree with that. I think
Right. So part of that is that you said in your article that the Americans and Europeans no longer agree on the Russian security threat. And you advocated an honest discussion of what NATO countries still have in common. For the US, you wrote NATO is now more a platform for projecting US global power than an alliance for European security. Do you think that honest discussion actually took place? Or are European leaders too fearful of President Trump's mood swings to raise such issues in his presence?
I think it definitely did not take place. We had sort of, in my view, the worst of all worlds. In public, Trump raised all of his grievances with NATO, made it clear that he didn't really see the U.S. as having a major stake in Ukraine war, made threats to seize Greenland, criticized NATO allies for their lack of support in the Iran war and their lack of defense spending. And then behind closed doors, everybody made nice, and we had sort of a harmonious discussion, and we came out with a very strong statement that hit all of the typical NATO talking points. So to outsiders who only saw the Trump portion, the alliance looks weak, and on the inside, we're still pretending it's business as usual. And as I wrote in my piece, I think this is a big mistake. I don't see how the alliance moves forward if the United States and Europe don't agree on what the threat they're planning for is, or if Europe sees NATO as about European security and the U.S. sees NATO as a platform for power projection to the Middle East. Those are fundamentally different views. And until you address this fracture, I don't see how you move forward. By covering it up, I think you widen the divide between the reality of an alliance that is fraying in serious ways and has changed in ways that can't be reversed. And the picture on the surface, which is everything is status quo. And I do think for European leaders, bringing up these problems is not their preference because they hope to keep things steady for long enough that they can build capabilities before the U.S. pulls back. I think that's a mistake because I think that we can talk about a managed transition and we can talk about the U.S. staying in until Europe is ready, but the United States will continue to do things in an uncoordinated way. They'll make a transition plan and ignore it. And we know that from, again, going back to the Pentagon statement that Germany was a model ally. And then 2 days later, that 5,000 troops were leaving Germany. That is going to be typical. That will be typical of U.S. foreign policy going forward. So in my view, European leaders burying their heads in the sand or hoping for the best is a huge mistake.
So a question for both of you, but perhaps first for Jennifer. And which of these various movies which you've described in Ankara do you think Vladimir Putin was watching? What do you think he'll have made of the Ankara summit? Will he have been more impressed by the communique with its strong support for Ukraine and reaffirmation of the Article 5 mutual defense clause, or by President Trump's rants against NATO allies?
I think it's a mix. I think we should acknowledge that everyone, including Putin and others in Moscow, see NATO as changed, that the U.S. is less interested in Europe's security. But I think the Western press and European governments massively misunderstand how Russia sees NATO and how they actually look at Europe. I think among people that I talk to in Moscow, there's great skepticism at this point that anything Trump says will come to fruition. So threats against Greenland, threats to pull out of NATO, they see these as sort of empty words, as rhetoric that have lost their power. They don't think U.S. foreign policy will ever change. They don't think the U.S. will ever leave Europe. And there's still a great degree of uncertainty about how the U.S. would respond in a crisis. So while European leaders want 100% certainty that the U.S. will be there, all you really need is 1% uncertainty in Russia about how the U.S. would respond to prevent a conflict. So I think actually in Russia, the sense is that even apart from the summit, that Article 5 is much more robust than maybe it's seen in Europe. I also think that from the Russian perspective, the summit was a mixed bag in the sense that they saw all these defense contracts being signed. They do see Europe spending more. There's questions about whether this actually comes to whether this money turns into combat capabilities, but there's concern about it. There's fear about European rearmament and a sense that Europe is becoming a more serious actor in the security space, and that's uncomfortable for Moscow. So on net, I really don't think that Moscow celebrated the summit or that Vladimir Putin was happy. They would have liked something much weaker. I think they are concerned about continued support to Ukraine. They saw no stepping back from Europe's willingness to support Ukraine to the end. So even a weakened NATO seems to be a significant threat. It still has conventional superiority, which is a concern. And there's worries that a future NATO could be stronger, or at least a stronger Europe, which would pose a greater threat to Russia.
Thanks. Well, Iana, let me put the same question to you. How do you think the Ankara summit will be interpreted in the Kremlin?
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Jennifer. It's great to hear your insights about the Ankara summit. Well, regarding the reading from Kremlin's side, I think there are two different lenses. First, the political rhetoric, and second, what is actually the outcome of the Ankara summit, which is quite tangible. As Jennifer also mentioned, there have been contracts signed. There has been initiatives at the Defense Industry Forum, like NATO Front Door for Industry, as a new platform to simplify how companies engage with NATO. There has been NATO's first public and classified demand signal to give industry greater visibility of allied capability requirements. And there have been initiatives of many more Europeans buying and procuring the defense capabilities. So I think in terms of the implementation phase from the Hague summit towards Ankara, we are witnessing a success story. In terms of the political signaling, as it was mentioned, the signals about, taking Greenland, seizing Greenland from Denmark, a NATO ally, and then Denmark saying that they will defend every inch of the NATO territory, including Greenland. I mean, these are the political signals that give a message to Kremlin that NATO is lacking cohesion. So these are the mixed signals. On another level, the signal we wanted to send to the adversaries at the Ankara summit was one, that Europeans are capable of deterrence deterrence, and stronger Europe is in a stronger NATO is coming up with 3.0, NATO 3.0. The deterrence is broken down into three elements, right? The capability, so the ability to deny gains or impose costs via the instruments of power. Second, the credibility, consistent and visible behavior that demonstrates resolve. And third, communication, messaging of intentions, thresholds, and consequences. And I'm quoting this from NATO's site. This is the definition from the NATO's website. So in terms of the capabilities we are building up, in terms of the communication, we are doing less than a medium job because we're signaling that we're not cohesive as an alliance, which is at the end of the day hurting our credibility. So this is my concern. What the conclusions that the Kremlin would take is that conventional attack on NATO remains extremely dangerous because Europeans have built up quite a capability to fight back, but there is still space to probe the political boundaries of Article 5, which means that there is room for below the threshold activities against the allies that will not trigger Article 5. That could be a sabotage, that could be a critical infrastructure attack, of the undersea cables, GPS interference, deniable operations. So these are still the area to maneuver for Kremlin. I will stop here, but happy to delve deeper.
Well, in your article in the EPC pre-summit compendium, you argued that NATO leaders needed to have an honest discussion. Once again, that term, honest discussion, as if they mostly had dishonest discussions. But you said they needed to have an honest discussion on what threats would actually trigger a collective military response. Notably, the threshold for responding to Russian hybrid warfare, as you describe in the Baltic states. These things we're already witnessing, attacks on undersea cables, on jamming of and spoofing of GPS signals, which can put aircraft and shipping into danger, all of these sorts of things. Was there such a discussion in Ankara as far as you can tell? And how do you think Eastern flank allies feel after this summit?
Well, I cannot comment on what happened behind the doors. I can only comment on the public parts. And what I can say in terms of the public communication is that there has not been sufficient understanding on public level of what could be the trigger for the hybrid warfare threats that are coming from Russia. So there is still room below the threshold of invoking Article 5, which can be used by Russia going forward. This also includes air incursions. This also includes sabotage on the eastern flank, etc., etc. So NATO understands the problem, but Ankara did not clearly define the thresholds for hybrid aggression. There is no mention of that. That has not been a clear benchmark for the Ankara summit. It was meant to be the delivering the implementation on the Hague commitment. So,
well, the Baltic allies did get one thing that they were pressing for and have been pressing for a long time, which was, at least on paper, an upgrading of the air policing that NATO's been doing over the Baltic states, which don't have air forces of their own, to an air defense mission. Now, if that's really part of NATO's integrated air defense, that ought to give them stronger protection against the kind of incursions you describe, no?
Yes, absolutely. But this also goes back to deterrence. If it is just the communication, and if it is lacking the capacity to go forward, if the push comes to shove, then there is a gap, and precisely that is the deterrence gap. So Ankara definitely strengthened the capacity side of the eastern flank, but NATO still has not worked out what will it do and what would be the thresholds for Article 5 if Russia attacks the Baltic states or any of the eastern flank member states of NATO. So this is definitely a room to improve going forward.
From your point of view, Iana, do you think Ankara was a stepping stone to an orderly burden shifting within the alliance? Or are you expecting more unilateral US withdrawals of key capabilities under this 6-month force posture review, which Secretary of War Hegseth announced before the summit?
Well, the Ankara summit definitely gave a lot of deliverables on site, and as Jennifer mentioned, some of them there are procurement progress going forward. There are some European allies going very strong in terms of what they will deliver in terms of the capabilities. There has been highlighting progress on defense investments, etc., etc. So in terms of this, there has been success. Europeans are stepping up, absolutely. On the other hand, yes, the narrative is that the Ankara should be understood as an attempt to make burden shifting orderly. At the same time, I have a very clear understanding, Jennifer, about what this means, the burden shifting, which is orderly. I mean, it is clear from the communique that stronger Europe in stronger NATO. So for me, this is an amplification of the European side capabilities, which will serve to NATO interests as well. Going forward, the Europeans should take care of their conventional defense, but at the same time, there has been also communication from the Secretary General that the force withdrawals, U.S. force withdrawals, and the force posture defense. Force posture review will continue, but in consultation and in coordination with the allies. So for me, this is the way to manage going forward the orderly burden shifting in consultation, in coordination with the allies. If there is a unilateral U.S. withdrawal, well, how to say, it has happened in past, so maybe there will not be a surprise for us think tankers, but we don't know if there has been a behind the door consultation, right? So I cannot say that there is a clear withdrawal from the United States side when we see such statements, and when the Secretary General is giving this positive or for us a positive rhetoric regarding the consultations and force posture review, then he speaks for all the allies. So I am leaning towards thinking that there is a hope for an orderly burden shifting. And again, if the Europeans are capable to defend themselves conventionally, Europe, then it's only logical that the U.S. force posture is reviewed, and
it's just a bit of a chicken and egg question.
Yes, it can be understood from different prisms, but with the given information we have as think tankers, I think there is a plausible chance of believing that there is an orderly burden shifting.
Well, inshallah, as they say in Ankara, I think there's a chicken and egg issue. If you pull out, for example, or decide not to deploy cruise missile units in Europe, which you've told the allies you're going to deploy, to fill a specific deterrence gap for sort of long-range strikes before the Europeans are yet in a position to produce their own, even if they agreed to do so, then is that you're creating, at least temporarily, a vulnerability. Perhaps it's a vulnerability which you judge that the allies can live with, given the overall deterrence posture, but an orderly process it isn't. Well,
the danger is not the burden shifting. The danger is the responsibility shifting faster than the capability, right? So the vulnerability arises if there is a deterrence gap. So this is what we should focus on, rather than whether there is a consultation or coordination per se, but if there is a deterrence gap created because of lack of consultation or coordination.
I mean, I think you have to assume that the force posture withdrawals will be unilateral. Like, in my view, the 6-month review is not intended to consult with the European allies, although some might happen. It's to make any changes that the Pentagon wants to make palatable to Congress, because Congress is looking for a rationale and an assurance that this is in U.S. interests. And so they're jumping through Congress's hoops to make the changes that they want to implement palatable to Congress, so they don't get so much U.S. political pushback. But I think you have to assume it will be uncoordinated.
Actually, Congress doesn't really want this to be happening, but it's one of those situations where it's not Congress pressing the administration to pull forces out of Europe and save money. It's the other way around. Congress has even legislated a minimum number of forces the United States must keep in Europe. It's the administration wanting to pull them out, to move them elsewhere. But anyway, final question to both of you. Actually, listening to you both, it sounds to me as if perhaps NATO summits should be replaced by NATO defense industry forums, which are more productive and serve a greater purpose of deterrence than the political chaos of some of the summit declarations, at least while the present incumbent is in the White House. But Jennifer, first to you. To what extent can European allies still count on the United States in case of, for example, a limited Russian incursion or a major hybrid event that causes casualties in Europe?
First, I think it's worth restating what Article 5 actually includes. It includes a requirement for countries to basically hold consultations if there's some kind of crisis. And this is a low and easily achievable bar. So the notion that Article 5 can be tested and proved to be a bluff, to me, misunderstands and overinflates what Article 5 actually requires. It does not require automatic deployment of U.S. military forces. If U.S. military forces didn't deploy, that wouldn't mean Article 5 is void. And I think we actually do the alliance a disservice by overinflating what the U.S. commitment actually is. But moving to the scenarios that you actually lay out, first of all, I think a ground incursion in the Baltics is really low odds for a number of reasons. I don't think there's any intention on the Russian side to execute that kind of operation right now or in the medium term. So I think there's so much focus on it. I think it's a little bit misplaced. But let's say it does happen. I think that the current administration would expect Europe to be on the front line and carrying most of the conventional burden. Depending on the context, all these things would depend on context. The U.S. would, at least now, would probably provide support. But the administration has made clear that if there were to be a real conflict, the idea that the U.S. forces would flow across the Atlantic or the cavalry would come, I think that idea is one of the past. They've made cuts to U.S. commitments to the NATO force model, and I think they are serious about that. I think the United States would provide intelligence support, air support, weapon support, logistics, but I think that there is very little appetite in the United States for fighting a war with Russia over the Baltics. And I think that's just the reality. I think over time, this is only going to grow more true. So I don't think that for frontline states, whether it's Poland or the Baltic states, the long-term plan for security can be the U.S. It has to be Europe or something else. In terms of the hybrid attack, I think there will be a question of attribution and what the appropriate response is. I agree that this was something that should have been discussed or needs to be discussed, but wasn't in Ankara. I don't think the United States would respond to some kind of hybrid attack, even one that caused casualties, where attribution was in a gray area. I don't think they would respond with an attack on Russia, maybe sanctions, maybe other types of pressure. But I can't imagine the U.S. going to war with Russia over a train line that exploded or an errant missile attack or an industrial facility that blew up that had casualties. These things, I think there would be a real effort to try to avoid escalation to real conflict. I think the U.S., depending on the number of casualties, it would be hard for the U.S. to stay out entirely. But I think almost no matter what, Europe is going to be disappointed with the U.S. response. It's not going to be the kind of response that they might have gotten 5 or 10 years ago. And the amount of willingness for the U.S. to get involved in these types of things, I think, will go down over time. So we're sort of in this half in, half out situation, which is probably a very uncomfortable place to be.
Yeah, Iana, that's a pretty sobering assessment. Would you agree with Jennifer that that's all the Europeans can expect is a sort of, well, we'll send you the satellite pictures and we'll let you continue to buy our weapons? Sounds a bit like the support the US is currently giving to Ukraine, which is not even what the Biden administration was giving. What do you think, Iana?
If we see the U.S. national security strategy and national defense strategy, I think they're very clear about their threat assessment and their priorities. So I think we should not ignore them as Europeans. I think we should read them very carefully, and we should just expect what they say. We should expect. So this is the realistic assessment. In the case of a clear Russian military attack against NATO territory, I still believe that the US will not be absolutely indifferent about it. The credibility of NATO remains enormously important to the American strategic power globally as well. So if the US simply fails to respond to an unmistakable armed attack on a NATO ally, the consequences would be going far beyond Europe. Every US ally around the world would immediately question American security commitments as well. So I would not absolutely equate American pressure or for burden sharing with an American decision to abandon NATO. The more difficult scenario is the one you mentioned, a limited incursion or a hybrid operation causing casualties. This is exactly why I'm advocating for a clear threshold under Article 5, so we can reduce the under the threshold activity, which is something that Russia is using as an area to maneuver. So this is where the question becomes much more political, as Jennifer expanded on it. Would all allies agree immediately on what happened? Would attribution be clear? Was this a deliberate Russian military operation or a proxy action? Was it a sabotage or something else? And what constitutes a proportionate response? That ambiguity is precisely what an adversary could try to exploit. This is what Russia has been exploiting so far. So my answer would be that Europeans can still count on the US, but they should no longer build their security strategy around the assumption that the US will automatically provide the majority of the conventional response in every scenario. It will be very, very selective if there is a response. So this is the fundamental change. The future transatlantic bargain is likely to be one where Europeans provide the bulk of conventional defense, particularly on the European continent, while the US continues to provide crucial strategic capabilities, nuclear defense and reinforcement capacity. But Europe also needs to become capable of managing the open phase of crisis itself, because in the Baltic region, geography matters enormously. A crisis can unfold in hours and days, not weeks. So the question Europeans should be asking is no longer simply, will America come? It should be, can Europeans deny Russia an opportunity to achieve a fait accompli before the alliance has collectively mobilized and decided on the response? So for me, that is the real strategic challenge after Ankara. And this is also the challenge of the deterrence factor as well. And paradoxically, a stronger European capacity to act independently in the first phase of a crisis is not about replacing the US. It is about the best way of keeping the US engaged, because it creates a more balanced and credible alliance. And credibility is part of deterrence as well.
Well, thanks to both of you for a really stimulating discussion. And that's all we have time for this week. But you can read much more about the NATO summit on our website, www.epc.eu. The Language of Power is going to take a summer break, but we'll be back in the first week of September with more geopolitical analysis of Europe and the world. In the meantime, many thanks to my colleague Simone Luswardi for helping to organize and record this podcast, and to you for listening. Have a great summer, and we'll be back soon.